We're delighted that our next talk is a talk by Professor Angela Mendelovici from Western University, the University of Western Ontario. Her talk is Keynote. We're delighted she agreed to join us and very much looking forward to how to reject the act-object distinction and be a Russellian Monist. Angela, please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Andre, for organizing this workshop and for inviting me. And thanks to everyone for all the great talks so far. I'm learning a lot about Russell. And thank you all for coming to my talk. I just want to apologize in advance for how blatantly anachronistic this talk is going to be. So I'm not a Russell scholar. I'm a philosopher of mind. So this talk is more in the spirit of celebrating Russell on this 150th anniversary of his birth. So I've chosen some of my favorite bits of Russell and tried to relate them to current debates and views in philosophy, in particular in philosophy of mind, that I think are interesting and even true. So this is a bit of a rational reconstruction of some ideas that I think we should borrow from Russell. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about intentional states. We can understand intentionality as a first pass as the ofness or aboutness of mental states. But a bit more precisely, we can define intentionality by pointing to paradigm cases of the phenomenon, like a thought that today we're at a conference or a perceptual experience of a blue cup. So these mental states seem to be of or about something. They seem to say something, that there's a blue cup or that we're at a conference. So this phenomenon that we notice in these kinds of mundane everyday cases, this phenomenon that we're tempted to describe representationally using terms like of or about, that's intentionality. It's very natural to think intentionality is relational, that it's a relation to a content which exists distinctly from your intentional state. So it kind of has a life of its own. So this content is what you're thinking, what you're perceptually representing, if you think perception represents, what you're representing more generally, what you're entertaining. And you get to represent it by being appropriately related to it. So these contents exist out there in the world, and when you get related in the right way to them, that's when you represent them. Okay, so these contents, they could be concrete things like mugs or facts that we might, if you're a naive realist, that you might perceive on a naive realist view of perception, or they could be abstract things like abstract propositions, abstract sets of possible worlds, sets of possible states of affairs, or clusters of abstract properties or world properties. I think it's fair to say that most philosophers today, maybe even most people, presuppose some kind of relational view along one of these kinds of lines. But some people who have specifically argued for this view more recently include David Bourget, Adam Pouts, David Chalmers, Jeff Speaks. Okay, so in some of Bertrand Russell's earlier works, like On the Nature of Truth, On the Nature of Truth and Falsehood, and Problems of Philosophy, he held various kinds of relation views. So initially, he endorsed a kind of dual relation view on which roughly intentional states are relations to propositions, which might be just facts when they're true or something else when they're false. But then, presumably because of difficulties surrounding false propositions, he came to endorse various versions of the multiple relation view, on which intentionality consists in a relation to multiple entities like objects and universals, each of which exists. Okay, so there are various time slices of Russell that defended versions of the relation view. Hold that intentional states are not relations to distinctly existing contents with a life of their own. Rather, intentional states are internal states, having certain properties or features or components which are what distinguish them from other intentional states and characterize them as the intentional states that they are. So contents are identified either with, there are different options here, either with the entire intentional state or a part or a property of that state. So on these non-relational views, the contents of intentional states don't have a life of their own. They don't exist independently and distinctly of us, of our intentional states. Instead, they are internal to us in some sense. Okay, so this is the view that I am partial to, and there's a growing, I think, minority of philosophers of mind who like views like that, like David Pitt, Laura Gow, Philip Woodward, and I always hesitate when the person's in the audience, but Mark Sainsbury, I think, can be interpreted along these lines. So he's coming at it from a very different kind of perspective than the other people on this list. Okay, interestingly, in later publications, like The Analysis of Mind and An Outline of Philosophy, Russell comes to reject the relation view and accepts a kind of non-relation view. Okay, so this comes in the form of rejecting the act-object distinction. So let me just say a little bit about that. So the act of an intentional state is the intentional state itself, the thinking, the perceiving, etc. The object of the intentional state is what the intentional state is directed at. So what is thought, what is perceived, and so on. So it's what we've been calling content. So on a picture that accepts the act-object distinction, intentionality is a relation to a content. So this is basically just the relation view that we talked about. Okay, the other relatum, on a view that accepts the act-object distinction, according to Russell, is supposed to be a self or a person who does the perceiving, the judging, and so on. And Russell himself did accept persons of this sort in his earlier relation views, but we'll see now he wants to reject them. Okay, so the view that Russell wants to reject then, when he rejects the act-object distinction, is the view that intentionality is a relation between a person and an object. Okay, so Russell puts pressure on this picture by first rejecting the person, saying that the person is not an ingredient in a single thought. They are rather constituted by relations of the thoughts to each other and to the body. The grammatical forms I think, you think, and Mr. Jones thinks are misleading if regarded as indicating an analysis of a single thought. It would be better to say, it thinks in me, like it rains here, or better still, there is a thought in me. Okay, now Russell does accept that we have bundles of thoughts and perceptual states and other mental states at a time, and that we have series of bundles across time. And from these ingredients, he defines perspectives, which are basically persons at a time, and biographies, which are basically persons over time. So he replaces the notion of a person with these kind of second best fallback notions. But the point here is that he thinks there's no distinct element, no person to play the role of being a relatum in an intentional state. Okay, so he's chipping away at the act-object distinction by first removing the person. That's the one relatum. And without the person, there's no relation, because now you've only got the other potential relatum, the object. But that object is no good either. So Russell writes, in suitable circumstances, we shall have the same perception, although there is no table. In fact, there is no event outside the brain which must exist whenever we see a table. It seems preposterous to say that when we think we see a table, we really see a motion in our own brain. So that's something that does exist, but that can't be the object. Hence, we are led to the conclusion that the object, which is essential to the existence of an act of perception, is just as mental as the perceiving. Okay, so basically, there need not be an external object when you see a table. Whatever table-ish thing you observe, that is not an external world table. And he continues, now, however, there seems no longer any reason to suppose that there is any essentially relational character about what occurs in us when we perceive. So we should reject the act-object distinction, and we should reject the relation view. Okay, so what about the table-ish thing that is in some sense present in your experience? What about that? For Russell, that is just a percept that is actually located in your head. When what you experience is your own internal percepts rather than some external thing, okay? So Russell basically lands on a kind of non-relational view here. He gives this example of a physiologist looking at an external world brain. So the physiologist's percept, the brain that they are in some sense aware of, that they experience, that is nothing more than a mental event inside the physiologist's head. So he says, the gist of the matter is that percepts are in our head. are in our heads, that percepts are what we can know with most certainty, and that percepts contain what naive realism thinks it knows about the world. I'll come back to that in a second. So the physiologist in the first instance is only observing their own mental event, not the brain of their subject. What the physiologist knows for certain is that their percept exists, not that some external world brain exists. And this diagram is a little bit misleading, because to do full justice to the view, we'd have to say that the internal mental event, the percept, has the richness and detail that we mistakenly attribute to the external brain. So really, it looks like this. All the richness you think is in the world, all that that naive realism thinks it knows about the world, all that is actually in your head. So Russell says, in the strict sense, the physiologist cannot observe anything in the other brain, but only the percepts, which he himself has when he is suitably related to that brain. Okay, what about the external world? We only know about it, for Russell, through inference, thanks to its interactions with our own mental events. And this idea, by the way, is one of the converging paths to Russell's structuralism about physics, which I'll touch on again at the end. Okay, so how do these objections stack up to contemporary versions of relation views? So contemporary versions of these views are mostly neutral on whether there are persons in some full-blown substantive sense. And many of them just assume that the subject side relatum of the intentionality relation is going to be an internal state, maybe a mental representation, which might be functionally or physically individuated. So even if persons don't exist, except maybe as bundles of experience or something like that, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem for most contemporary relation views. Okay, so Russell's rejection of persons wouldn't really be dialectically effective against contemporary relation views. What about the rejection of objects? So apart from naive realists, most relation theorists take contents, the objects of intentional states, to be abstract entities. So they would account for your perceiving a table that doesn't exist by saying that, the perceptual state consists in a relation to a cluster of abstract properties, which does exist, or to an abstract proposition to the effect that there is a table before you, which also they would say does exist. So basically representing something non-existent is a matter of being appropriately related to something else, an abstract thing, which is existent. And by the way, this is very much in line with some of Russell's earlier ideas when he was a relation theorist. Okay, so that helps with some cases, like that of hallucinating a table. You're just related to the property of being a table or a property cluster consisting of color and shape properties, or maybe an abstract proposition that there is a table, and maybe that maybe these abstracta that you need to pull this off are merely what are sometimes called Aristotelian abstracta. So they're nothing over and above their instances or combinations of existing concrete things. So they're not very metaphysically costly. Okay, you don't have to say there's more than the concrete world to get them. But the view gets more costly if you think we can represent primitive properties that happen to be uninstantiated, like arguably the property of redness that we can perceptually represent, which you might think is a primitive property. It's not analyzable or reducible to other properties, and it's not identical to any physical color properties like dispositions to reflect certain wavelengths of light, which do exist and are instantiated in the world, but that's not what we see when we see colors. Okay, so if you think that you can represent these kind of primitive properties that happen to be uninstantiated, then you have a problem for this way of dealing with representing things that don't exist. Because since such a property would be primitive, you can't construct it out of existing concrete property instances or other stuff in the concrete world. Concrete world is not enough to get you this content. Okay, so we need to invoke some more heavy-duty Platonic abstracta, maybe Platonic properties or propositions, and now that is ontologically costly, especially if you think that there aren't good independent reasons to be committed to such Platonic entities. Okay, so in short, the problem of representing non-existence, or at least some kind of version of it, is alive and well today, and it remains, I think, a motivation for rejecting the relation view. And Mark Sainsbury has written some interesting stuff about that from a perspective of philosophy of language and propositional attitude descriptions. Okay, and I want to mention one more argument that Russell makes here against at least some versions of the relation view. And this is this quick argument that he makes in multiple places against naive realism, on which we're in some sense directly aware of external objects. So he says, now it is contrary to all scientific canons to suppose that the object perceived, by which he means the external object that we're causally sensitive to in an instance of perception, in addition to affecting us in the way of stimulus and reaction, also affects us directly by some mystical epiphany. Okay, so some external thing that we're merely causally related to, merely causally sensitive to, can't just reveal itself to us somehow as if it were through some mystical epiphany. That'd be really weird and magical. It'd be unscientific of us to believe that. It's unscientific because our best science tells us that perception is this complex causal process whereby external objects cause our experiences via intermediary external and internal events. So it's this causally mediated process. To say that experience somehow reveals something that's far removed from its proximate cause would be really magical, he says. Okay, so this kind of worry with relation views more generally, I think, also comes up in contemporary debate. So the idea here that many different people have come at from different directions is that it's mysterious just how bearing some kind of relation to something, whether it's a concrete thing or an abstract thing, doesn't matter, just bearing some kind of relation to something can make that thing present to you, entertained by you, or somehow represented by you in some kind of psychologically meaningful way, a way in which we know that our contents are. They influence our behaviors and we can introspect on them. So how can just merely being related to something make that thing available to you in this epistemically meaningful way? And it doesn't matter whether the thing is concrete or abstract. It doesn't really matter what the relation is, whether it's a primitive relation or a causal relation, a relation of isomorphism or whatever. How can any such relation make the thing on the far side of that relation present to you in this way? So that seems kind of magical. Okay, so as you can tell, I like the non-relation view, but there are some, there are some important questions for the view. So one is, what are the relevant non-relational states? So what are these states? What are they? Physical states of the brain, or what are they? So there are different options here, but I think the most promising one is that they are just phenomenal states. They're states of phenomenal consciousness, which are construed non-relationally. So that's to subscribe to what's sometimes called a phenomenal theory of intentionality, on which intentionality at bottom is a matter of having certain phenomenal states, or at least the most fundamental kind of intentionality is that. So when you perceive a red triangle, you are having a reddish, triangle-ish phenomenal experience. And that's what it is to perceive a red triangle, to have a perceptual experience of a red triangle. And the same goes for other intentional states, at least, again, of the most fundamental. How more than one subject can think the same thought or more generally represent the same content. Aren't contents essentially in some way on this view? So on the relation view, this is just a matter of being related to the same content, but we can't say that on the non-relation view. That's not a huge problem. We can just say that shared contents are a matter of having maybe type identical intentional states, maybe similar intentional properties, which again might just be phenomenal properties. Okay, and David Pitt has a lot to say to defend this view against these kinds of worries. The most interesting challenge, I think, is that of explaining how, on this kind of view, we make any kind of interesting epistemic contact with the world at all. So if our contents are just in our heads, then how do they manage to refer to or be made true by, or in any other way make contact with the external world? And I think this problem has been somewhat underappreciated in contemporary debates, though I'd point you to a great paper by Walter Ott on this, and David Papineau does touch on this worry in his recent book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. Okay, now a little bit too much, which he was a bit smitten by at that time, and perhaps deflates the phenomenon of interest a bit more than we would like. But I do think that some other ideas inspired by Russell's earlier works can help us here. They can kind of help us claw our way out of the mind, because that's basically what I think we have to do here. Okay, so the direction I think we should be looking in is this. So we need to consider what we are acquainted with in a more or less Russellian sense. So presumably on a picture like this would be our own mental states and their features. Okay, and then we need to see if we can construct some kind of descriptions or criteria of truth and reference using tools like Russellian descriptivism, such that they give us the desired conditions of truth and reference for individual internal states. And so insofar as we can do that, and insofar as we actually do endorse the relevant descriptions or criteria that we can come up with, then maybe we can actually specify conditions of truth and reference that external objects and facts might just satisfy. Okay, so that's a really tall order, but I think this is the right way to frame the question of how we make contact with the external world, if we do at all, in any kind of epistemically meaningful way. But obviously a lot more would have to be said to see if this can be made to work. Okay, I want to really briefly close by saying that this overall picture is really congenial to contemporary versions of Russellian Monist panpsychism, which is a kind of another area of Russell's work that has inspired a lot of people today. So in its contemporary form, at least, Russellian Monist panpsychism is the view that consciousness, here I mean phenomenal consciousness, the what it's like of experience, not consciousness in the sense that Russell uses the term, which means something else. So consciousness is the categorical nature of the physical, or put otherwise, the physical is the causal dispositional profile of the mental. Okay, so on this view, all fundamental things are phenomenally conscious. And if there are any non-fundamental things that are phenomenally conscious, perhaps like us, maybe we're such things, their consciousness is a matter of the combination of the phenomenal features of their constituent parts. So all fundamental things are conscious, and non-fundamental things are get their consciousness from combinations of fundamental things. Okay, so I think the non-relation view paves the way to a kind of intrinsic natures argument of the sort that is associated with Russell, and we see this in the Analysis of Matter and an Outline of Philosophy. So remember the physiologist who observes somebody else's brain, but really they're only observing their own inner states. Okay, so back to the physiologist. So the brain that the physiologist knows, it's just their own percept. Okay, so what about the external brain then? What's that? Their only understanding of this external brain that's supported by observation and science is structural and mathematical. That is what they know of it. So Russell writes, physics is mathematical not because we know so much about the physical world, but because we know so little. It is only its mathematical properties that we can discover. He has other converging lines of argument for this kind of structuralism. Okay, so that leads us to the intrinsic natures argument, more or less as we know it. We don't know the intrinsic nature of this structural thing through physics or observation, but we might suppose that it's not different from the intrinsic nature of mental events, which is something that we do know. So in Russell's words, he says, we now realize that we know nothing of the intrinsic quality of physical phenomena except when they happen to be sensations, and that therefore there is no reason to be surprised that some are sensations or to suppose that the others are totally unlike sensations. So the categorical intrinsic nature of the structures that we are is consciousness. We have no reason to think that the categorical nature of other structures is not consciousness. And here I mean consciousness in the contemporary sense of what it's like, not Russell's sense. So maybe it is. Okay, so the point is that I'm making here is that the non-relational view allows you to make the intrinsic natures argument, and it does so by supporting a structuralist view of what we can know about the external world. So things in the world are not revealed to us as on a kind of naive realist view. All we can do is make inferences about what they're like based on the experiences that they cause in us. And that is what science ultimately tells us at bottom. But this leaves underdetermined the intrinsic nature of external reality. We can only guess what it is by considering our own case, in which it's consciousness. Apart from paving the way for the intrinsic natures argument, the non-relational view makes for an attractive combination with Russellian Monist panpsychism. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. So in effect, what you've got is a bunch of non-relational intentional states that are interacting with each other. So it's basically, the end result is basically a kind of idealism, not in the sense of everything is an idea in my mind or somebody else's mind, but in the sense of everything is mental. And the mental bits change and causally interact with each other in regular and predictable ways. The mental is intrinsic and categorical through and through. There are no relational mental phenomena in this picture. It's all intrinsic phenomenal natures and their interactions. That's what reality is. And that's it. And just some shameless self-promotion. If you want to find out more about this positive contemporary picture that I've been sketching, a lot of that is in my book, which you can get at OUP online. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Professor Mendelovici, and I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in applauding your work. And thanks for the plug into the book. We'll make sure to go look at it. So now if there's some questions, comments, rejoinders, please make yourselves known. You can use the raise hand button under reactions, or you can just wave if you're on video stream, and I'll make sure I see you. So let me just make sure I raise a quick question of my own, and this is going to be very broad and just by way of recapping what your point might have been. So you're supporting a relational view of intentionality, but you're considering the objections that Russell had to it. And you're considering ways in which a non-relational view could be paired with Russellian monism so that it could be the best competing candidate for a relational view. Is that the overall dialectic?
I'm not sure if you misspoke. I'm supporting a non-relational view. So yeah, so I'm supporting a non-relational view, and yeah, and seeing how it can be combined. I mean, the last part was just kind of a little throwaway, but that's ultimately the view that I like, a combination of this kind of Russellian monism, panpsychism, with a non-relational view.
So given that, and since the thought is to overcome the act-object distinction, this distinction has traditionally been thought to be attractive. And so I was wondering if, other than ditching the distinction, there's a way to capture what people thought might be conceptually useful about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely useful to talk about the content of an intentional state. So you know, what does the state say? What is it presenting to you? I think the mistake is then saying that this thing, this content, has a life of its own, that it exists independently of your representing it. So maybe it's an aspect of your intentional state. So some versions of this kind of view call themselves, like Uri Kriegel calls this kind of view, a kind of adverbialism about experience. about intentionality more generally, right? So it's a way of representing. So it's like it's a property of your act of representing, rather than some object that you're related to that, you know, that has a life of its own. So I think it's useful to talk about content and to isolate that aspect of an intentional state. I think we can talk in abstraction, about different contents and how they're related. We can talk about whether people represent the same content, by which we mean not the same, like not have the same token instance of that content, but maybe the content of the same type or something like that. So it's a useful notion, but we can do, I think, all of that without having to be a relationist about intentionality. We don't have to like reify contents, right?
All right, thanks so much. And I have a couple of other short clarificatory questions, but we'll come back to them. I want to make sure I don't monopolize the conversation. So there are some rejoinders. I see Professor James Cargyle. Jim, please go ahead.
So there is a problem sometimes for a legal assessment of testimony and eyewitness testimony. And there's a question about whether it was direct witness or not. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I love Shostakovich's line, the old Russian, he lies like an eyewitness. But anyway, if there is a question about whether someone was seeing it directly, would some of the theories that you've been discussing be a basis for saying that that was out of the question? Would they be relevant, in other words, to an issue of this sort?
So maybe to put it in the form of an objection, don't we need to make a distinction between direct and indirect perception, such that something, don't we need to make that distinction and everything comes out kind of indirect or perception at all or something like that on this picture? I guess I would say, yeah, I guess I would say like for direct something else here. So
I thought so, yes.
Yeah, like less mediated or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can have so to put it in the kind of non-relational, a non-relational construal of what's going on is you can have a certain percept or intentional state that is caused through via a shorter causal chain or a longer causal chain. You could this causal chain that can also differ in how many other causes apart from the thing that you're saying you're causally sensitive to. Converge.
So this is philosophy, not law.
Yeah, and you can reconstruct whatever you want to say in terms of the ingredients that were given here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks so much. Next up, a question from Professor Sainsbury. Mark, please go ahead.
I was going to ask what it would be for a content to have a life of its own, which you say it doesn't. Because you do allow that the same person could exercise the same content on different occasions, and that different people could exercise the same content. So there's some independence from their exercise. And I wonder what it would be to deny that they have a life of their own, given that there is this degree of independence.
Yeah, so a life of its own just means that it exists. It's a metaphor pointing to it exists kind of distinctly from your intentional state. So if nobody was around to represent this content, it would still exist, like an abstract proposition or whatever, an abstract property cluster or whatever. Okay, but I also said that two people can represent contents of the same type. So doesn't that admit that there are types that exist distinctly from people representing them? two answers. One is I really think it's the content token that you, strictly speaking, need in order to have the intentional state. So it's the content token that plays the explanatory role here. And then when we're talking about public contents, that's just to say that we have tokens of the same type. So strictly speaking, my content is distinct from yours, but there's a way that, a manner of speaking where we can say, well, we're thinking the same thing because we have contents of the same type. A second part to the answer is, well, what about the types? You could be like a Platonist about them, and you could still think that the types have a life of their own, but you could also think that they are just dependent on their instances. So if nobody was around to represent redness, then there might not even exist the type. But you can go either way on that. That doesn't really affect the first part of the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for the questions and answers. If there are some more rejoinders. Greg, please go ahead, Professor Labers.
Okay, thank you for that talk. So Russell obviously takes many different positions at many times, and I was talking yesterday about his naturalism and his rejection of Kantianism, where he's rejecting the view that the universe is mental, but of course he also held the opposite, which I'll have to look into more. Now, so the question is, it seems as you presented as if they're somewhat independent, this panpsychism and the non-relational view. And it seems to me that if you have an external world, the way we normally think of it, then even if somehow they weren't in themselves relational states, there would still be a relation between those states. And right, if we both see a dog, let's say, and the dog is something in the world apart from our representation, then even if those states are not in themselves somehow relational, they each have some relation to the dog. Is that right, that you can't really have one without the other, or am I mistaken about that?
So in accepting a kind of non-relational view of intentionality, we don't have to deny that there are other relations that we bear with things in the world. So things in the world can still cause our internal states, and Russell thinks that they do. There's a lot of behaviorism in these writings too. But he thinks, ultimately, like what it is to really know something or think something or have a perceptual experience, that is a non-relational thing. But we can also talk about man from the outside, from a kind of behaviorist perspective, and there we talk about stimulus response and conditioning, and and causal relations between stimuli and internal states. So there's all that too. But then ultimately that breaks down because ultimately, well, it doesn't break down, but it doesn't give you a complete picture because it leaves out the core of knowledge, which is this internal state that is non-relational, from which we can infer that all this other stuff is happening. So in short, yes, there can be other relations that we bear to things in the world, but true intentionality is not relational in this way, with the caveat that Russell does want to give like a kind of relational behaviorist analysis of belief and true belief. So it's kind of like, but that's kind of almost like eliminativist, right? He's just saying like, well, you're not really related to a proposition. You just have all these behavioral dispositions, and that's what it is to believe. But but the core of our knowledge really is like the true, the real deal. That's this non-relational thing. But I'm not sure if that's entirely the right way to interpret Russell. But that's my best understanding. And I totally agree with you. There's a little bit for everyone, something for everyone in Russell.
So could I actually maybe ask a quick follow-up to that? So I was just trying to wrap my mind around exactly what the relational, non-relational difference is supposed to be. So if suppose that the contents in question were the percepts in question, right? And so when it seems to me that I see the table, it seems to me that the table is a physical object, I'm just wrong about that latter seeming, because the table I'm acquainted with is really some kind of sense datum, a complex one or something like that, percept. Okay, and let me not use the sense data jargon. Okay, so then again, it would still seem as though it's relational. It's just relational to a percept. Right? Is that correct?
I don't know if Russell would want to say that. And I think if he did say that, it would start looking a lot like a sense datum view of the kind that perhaps we want to say he might be moving away from here. He doesn't talk about sense data in these writings. I would not want to say that, because it would look like a sense data view. Like you've got this sense datum that's kicking around in your head, and then you get related to it, and that's how you perceive something, right? So I don't think we have good reason to think that there's this kind of gap between the percept and you're perceiving the percept or something like that. So I personally would want to reject that. I think Russell should too. I personally have not found very, very strong textual evidence for his rejecting. Maybe somebody else here who's more of an expert than I am would say that. I mean, he kind of fudges. He says like, oh, the percept, that's just in your head. So it's just as mental as you're perceiving it. So we should do away with all this relation talk, right? So he kind of fudges a little bit, but it would be nice to see him kind of confront his earlier views and say exactly what he wants to keep and what he wants to reject of them. But maybe somebody else can help here.
You might just be playing fast and loose with internal there. Right. So there was a very nice slide. I mean, this is just a presentation was wonderful. There was a slide you had where you had different colors, and then when we're acquainted with the table, there was this little arrow, and then we had the description of the table, and that was all grayish or something like that. And it just seemed as though in order to be acquainted with anything, one would require knowledge by description as well. Was that the thought?
I mean, the thought there, this was about how do we connect with the external world in some epistemically meaningful way if all that you really directly know is your own internal states. And that's what, you know, having these internal states, that's what intentionality consists in. So how do you think about the world? Aren't you just trapped inside your own mind? And that's where I was suggesting that maybe some other tools from Russell can help us here. So maybe you want to say you're acquainted with your own internal states, but you can know the world by description made up of stuff that you're acquainted with. Maybe you can kind of like rearrange the pieces in the right way. That's obviously a really, really tall order. Russell,
Right.
like the previous Russell had universals as part of his basic vocabulary, but now we only have at best features of our mental states, properties of our mental states, maybe instances of those properties. I don't know. So we have a much more limited vocabulary here to kind of construct descriptions or possibly general criteria of truth and reference that we can endorse. So it's going to be a more challenging project, but I think this is what we got to do to refer to the external world and to specify conditions of truth and reference. You know, otherwise we're just going through the motions. Maybe that's what we're doing. But
Well, it's certainly a challenging package of views. I mean, yeah, it's terrific. So let me come back with more questions as I leave room for others to join the conversation. So if you have any questions, comments, or joinders, Maureen, please go ahead.
I just wonder whether it would be useful to compare contents with words. So the metaphysics of content seem rather difficult to understand. Not that the metaphysics of words is completely straightforward or anything, but still, when it comes to words, and the question is, does language relate us to the world or not? That would be a kind of analog of your question about intentionality. But then the right answer seems to be on the lines, well, some words do and some words don't. So phlogiston doesn't and gold does. And we can control what words we think about, but of course we can't control the way the world is just by taking thought, or not in that same way. So I just wondered whether you thought there might be a useful analog here. I mean, there's a sense in which words don't have a life of their own either. Let's say there are creations. We use them more or less successfully to represent. So you've got the sort of three issues that you were concerned with, but in a structure which contains words rather than contents. So you've got the subject, the words, and the world. I just wondered whether you thought that was analogous to the threefold picture that concerned you with the self, the contents, and the world.
I mean, maybe so in general, I find things much more obscure when you're talking about language. So I think in terms of thinking about meanings and contents, it's got to be mind first. That's the source of all meaning and content. So I'm not very optimistic about learning things about the mental case from the case of language. But let's see, maybe this analogy can be kind of illuminating. So some words do connect with the world, some words don't. And you're saying words could be thought of as analogous to contents, right? Not to mental states, but to contents, right? So I mean, on some views, words have meanings that are distinct from their reference. So like an empty term might still have some kind of meaning or sense or something like that, right? So that part of the analogy would break down. It would be more analogous to maybe say the senses or the meanings are analogous to contents, and then some of the meanings, also pick out a referent or are true, and then some are not, and then that would be more analogous to saying, like, content, some of them do make a connection with the world in some way, and some of them don't. So maybe that would be more of an analogy that I would want to make if we're going to make analogies with language.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wouldn't want to say, like, so I mean, there are different views in language. I wouldn't want to say that, language exists as this kind of like, or if you want to say that language exists as this, this public thing that kind of has a life of its own, and there are meanings that attach to words independently of, of users, unless that's kind of like an abstraction or something like that, then I would say that has no real analog in the case of contents.
Mm. Well, would you think contents are artifacts? Language is presumed in artifacts a creation, something that gets made by humans. Mm-hmm. Is that true of contents too?
No. So, so contents, at least many mental contents, are a matter of like intrinsic intentionality. And then if you think, that language is a, it's an artifact of creation. It has some kind of like derived intentionality. I mean, of course, there are different views in this area, but that seems the most plausible. So that would be a kind of disanalogy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So if there's some other comments, questions, rejoinders? Could I just briefly come back to an earlier question that was raised? I mean, oftentimes I think people do talk this way. If I'm having a vivid experience, say, of eating an apple, right? And then I'm asked by some clever psychologist to introspect, right? I'll then say, oh, hang on a second, I need to focus on what my experience is like for me. I need to focus on that phenomenal redness, phenomenal roundness, and so on. And so once again, it would seem as though it's sort of a natural tool to appeal to this act-object distinction. The phenomenal property of redness was there all along before the spotlight of my attention sort of shone light on it, right? And so I could well see how one could wish to refrain from appealing to the distinction, right? But then it would seem as though if you had a number of adverbialist views, for instance, they could be retranslated in the act-object jargon, right? Is that right? Or
Yeah, yes, but just to add to that, maybe there's more we can give you. So you can still say that attention is a relation to a mental state, or that even that certain forms of introspection are relational. So for example, you might think that that at least one kind of introspection is a matter of embedding a lower order thought in a higher order thought, like I am experiencing, and then there's that that lower order mental state thought, or whatever it is, as a literal constituent of your introspective judgment. So on a view like that, then you can achieve like direct reference to your own mental states, and that is relational, because the lower order state has a life of its own. It exists distinctly from the and maybe that's what acquaintance looks like on this kind of picture where we're going to invoke acquaintance. So so you can still say that when you introspect on your mental states and you form judgments about them and you consider them as like objects of thought in themselves, as opposed to just tasting the apple and having the non-relational states that you have and tasting the apple, you can also make that like the target of some further state. That could be relational, and I think it is. But so maybe that's enough to kind of satisfy what you want to say here.
right, I think it is. And I just wonder, just to revert back to, I mean, when I saw that this is much more blatantly anachronistic than anything you've said in your talk. But when I considered the quotes you gave from Russell, I was just thinking of what some early functionalist folks would say, right? So there's the information structure that is produced when the brain processes all these things, and then something surfaces to consciousness, right? And there seems to be a kind of internal relationality there when the sort of the taste of the apple sort of emerges to consciousness. There seems to be a relation between the content and the vehicle of the state in question, right? Now, perhaps that's a different kind of relation. Perhaps that shouldn't be cashed out in relational terms. I'm not sure, but it just seems like an easy and verbal trick to cash it out relationally. Perhaps the easiness of doing that is itself something suspicious, but I don't know.
I mean, it sounds like maybe you're attracted to a kind of like inner spotlight view of consciousness. So you've got like all this functional stuff, and that gives you this this material for consciousness, but then it actually becomes conscious when you become related to it, right? Like a kind of like inner, perception kind of view. I mean, you could have a view like that. So, so the non-relational view doesn't in itself say anything about consciousness. So you could think that it's all intentional, non-relationally, but then it gets conscious when you shine the spotlight of consciousness on it. And maybe this non-relational intentionality is a matter of functional interrelations and functional roles at different internal states. So you could have a view like that. That's not my view, but you could have a view like that. My view is that that intentionality is the consciousness itself, and that's not relational. It's not a matter of bearing some kind of relation to an antecedently existing state or something like that, which then becomes the content of your consciousness. It just is intrinsically, in virtue of its very nature, conscious, and hence intentional. And of course, there are questions of what you're going to say about unconscious states, and that's something that that people who hold this kind of view discuss about. But that's a further question.
Right. So I'm not advocating for a view of my own here, but this was intended to segue into this. So I was just wondering what the force of Russell's initial complaint was. So because sometimes our percepts don't have something in the physical world to match them, then we should consider percepts instead of physical objects. And so somebody might say, look, there is some kind of brain processing that corresponds to seeing the table in the room. And there's R1 from my conscious state to that kind of percept, and R2 from the percept to the table. And obviously I could do R1 composed with R2. And so what's the benefit of just moving it upstairs? It doesn't seem as though, I mean, just because that's going to happen only sometimes or disjunctively rather than always. I mean, yeah, so what's the problem? I mean, I was just trying to see the force of that.
And maybe this goes back to your earlier question about sense data, right? And whether there could be like contents could be internal things that we're related to. Does Russell rule out that view by saying there's no physical external world table? I think no. So maybe there's more to argue for here for Russell to rule out that kind of view.
All right, thanks so much. And I saw there was another comment from Jim. Please go ahead.
Well, this is just another terminology comment. We have dear friends who have a large boulder in their backyard. It's quite handsome. And I gather that on the usage of some of the philosophers you've been discussing, this would qualify as an artifact. Is that right?
Sure. Yes. I don't know. I don't know much about this boulder, but I also don't have very strong views about artifacts. I'm not sure what Russell's views were.
I see. I'm sorry. Actually, the word was suggested to me by Professor Sainsbury's remarks, but at any rate, so it might not be worth pursuing. I was just going to observe in the same style as the last one about the law, that if you put a table beside this boulder and asked the vast majority of non-philosophers which was the artifact, they would unhesitatingly tell you the table was one and the boulder wasn't. And I would find it, quite obscure to insist on this being a mistake. Sorry. Anyway, that was.
I mean, so it's kind of a response to your earlier question, like pointing to kind of a context sensitivity of when something counts as something else. If there, I
wasn't thinking about context sensitivity, but just what most people mean as far as terminology is concerned.
Yeah, like what counts as an artifact will depend on context. So if there's a better example of an artifact right next to it, then you're going to withhold saying that the boulder is an artifact.
I don't think in terms of context much, but at any rate, I would think it would depend more on who you brought to the context. And you would try to understand what people were saying about it. And the easiest would be, well, for me, the ones I'm familiar with. Sorry.
I think that's a great remark, suggesting that there are unseen ties between the metaphysics of artifacts and the metaphysics of mental content. Thanks so much for that. And are there any other rejoinders, comments, or final questions? And if not, please join me once again in thanking Professor Mendelovici for a wonderful keynote talk.